welcome to Saku members and welcome to non-members who may be joining this seminar series for the first time. This is Lecture 3 in our series, A Practical Guide for Everyday, The Art of Living from the Confucian Tradition. We're delighted that our speakers, Dr. Catherine No and Dr. Kelly No, have offered to give these seminars for Saku and share their understanding of living with the Confucian tradition. Our lecture this evening is called How to Speak Well, a Confucian Guide to Conversation. Everyday chats and messages can be a source of joy, anger, or sadness. We're looking forward to hearing about the discussions and advice that Confucius gave. This series of seminars is part of a big programme that is underway to celebrate Saku's 60th year. Watch our newsletters, social media and our website for news of other events coming up soon. And if you're not a member, please think about joining us. There are lots of benefits and you can join on our website. So you can join quite simply online, www.sacu.org.uk. Do sign up for the next series of 3 talks running from April to June on the theme of making friends and entertaining. The bookings are now open on Eventbrite, and I've put the links in our chat already. Now, our plan for this hour is that Dr. Catherine No will share the lecture for about 40 minutes, and we'll then have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Please, if you have questions, please type them in the chat, and Drs. Catherine and Dr. Kelly will respond to them. Oh, please keep yourselves on mute, and the session will be recorded and will be made available later on. So in a moment I'll hand over to our speakers. Dr. Catherine and Dr. Kelly have divided the lectures between them. So tonight it's Dr. Catherine speaking to us. And I'd like to introduce her briefly to you and then hand over. Dr. Catherine No is a lecturer in ancient Chinese literature at the University of Wales, Trinity, St. David. Catherine trained and practiced as a medical doctor for several years in Sydney, Australia. Her current research interest is in the educational theories and practices of pre-modern and early modern Chinese didactic literature. She has co-authored a source book of traditional Chinese children's primers, which will be published later this year, November 2025. She's currently working on a translation of the Collectania of Ethical Accounts, Da Dao Zong Shu. So, with that, I'll hand over to you, Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ros. Allow me to give me a few seconds to share the screen of PowerPoint. Okay, hopefully that's visible.
Yes, that's visible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay. Yes, thank you so much, Ros, for that wonderful introduction. And it's a real honor to be here with Saku, to be able to contribute in a very small way to what we can together continue the understanding between the cultures and the friendship. So what a wonderful mission of Saku, and Kelly and I are really very privileged and honored to be part of this wonderful mission. So I guess with these lectures, as we planned them, Kelly and I, we talk about it and explore these ideas with colleagues and students every day, but probably on a more technical and a specialist level. So it's wonderful to take a step back and think about it on this practical level. Also, given this is the third talk, but I would also welcome any feedback and comments. If it is too technical or not technical enough, we're happy to move it towards the direction that Saku wants, because it is an ongoing series. So I would welcome any feedback. So please send your feedback to Roz or to Saku generally, if you don't think about it today at the end of this talk. So the focus today is on conversation, which is very important for Confucius. It was actually the one of his 4 subjects that he taught as part of his curriculum. But interestingly, Confucius, Mencius, and even later Confucians didn't really provide a guidebook just specifically on conversational communication. Nothing like Aristotle's rhetoric, about persuasion. But actually, when we think about it, Confucius and Mencius really didn't need to, because what we have and what's recorded of their words is not the theory, but it's the practice. It's what they did. When we look at the 2 main sources that we go to for Confucius's words, you'd all be familiar with the Analects and possibly the school sayings of Confucius. You'll notice that in both of these titles, there is a word that is common to both titles. It's the last word here, you. So actually this particular word I want to explore with you a little, because it is different from what we might think of it today. So a lot of people, they might say Analects, but they think about the sayings of Confucius. They might translate it as the sayings of Confucius. But this particular character in a classical or literary context is slightly different. So let's explore that a bit. So the word you, of course, in modern English speech or speaking or discourse, yan yu, right? This is the 2 words, it's a binome. But actually, when we look at the earliest Chinese dictionary, the Shuowenjiezi, there's 2 different meanings. So yan, the first word here, means to speak without any prior prompting, without anyone talking to you, sort of a monologue, or you could say a lecture. You, the word that we're focusing on here, is actually meaning conversation and dialogue and discourse. So it's a 2-way street. And the etymology or the philology of the character for yen, which also forms the radical for the left part of the character you, is what I've put here, tracing back from the top, which is the earliest, the oracle bone script, right down to how we write it now. And if we look at the earliest, it's actually quite pictographic-like, although it's a composite character. Let me blow that up for everyone. So here, the box down the bottom in Chinese kou is the mouth, the open mouth, right? And then coming out of that is meant to be the tongue. And then on top of the tongue is this horizontal line, which is meant to be the sound waves that are produced, or the sound that comes out when the tongue moves. So it's clearer here in the seal script, or the seal script. This is the bronze script, that there's 2 lines. Okay? But this is continuous. You can see that form continuous to the seal script before it became the clerical and ultimately the modern script, which is how it's written now. But it's meant to be a mouth with a tongue and sound waves, which is quite interesting, this idea of speech. In literary Chinese, it means speaking generally, whereas you is the word for conversation. So when we look again back at the Analects or the school sayings of Confucius, we're actually looking at conversations. They are what Confucius said in context. They're not his own, they're not the way we see it now. It seems as if they are simply sentences without a specified audience, but actually they were no context. The title has been described by various commentators throughout history as in different ways. So lun through its sound, but also its meaning, its semantics, in 5 different ways. But put together, lun yu, the 2 words, could be literally translated as conversations on the natural patterns of the world. So this pattern here is referring to a comprehensive pattern of the world and understanding that is recorded by this book and through Confucius's conversations. The silk cord, as you can see, this is a bit strange, doesn't it? It's not the literal cord, but it's meant to represent the fact that the ideas bind the past and the present. It's a link between the past and present. And the wheel is the idea that the philosophy here is ever turning. So it's timeless, but it's also ever adaptable as well. So that's the metaphor of the wheel. So the analects in that title, just through the title, the Chinese title, we can see that it's conversations. And clearly these conversations were very effective. The students remembered them, it stayed in their minds, they were able to transmit them to their own students and talk about them. And so we know that the authorship of the analects was not by one person, one student, or even 2, but it was a composite sort of authorship throughout a period of time. There's various strata in the analects. So much so that people will say, well, it wasn't the first generation, it could be second generation, third generation. So students of students of students who throughout different periods of time compiled this. So what we can see, what the analects and other texts with Confucius's conversations are testament to is his being a master of conversation, his being a master of communication. So we're learning from a real master of communication. Rather than, in this very short time that we have, rather than give you sort of, would say, 7 habits or 3 strategies or something like that, I'd like to frame the discussion in terms of metaphors. So I'm going to start off with the metaphor of a bell. Here's a metaphor of a bell. Confucius was described as a bell, a wooden clappered bell, but the reference I'm thinking of particularly comes from classic, this Confucian classic, and it's from a chapter that specifically refers to the education pedagogy, and then this passage is about the craft of answering questions. So the craft of answering questions is to be like a bell. As it says here, the sound that arises is completely consistent with how the bell is struck. And so, in other words, what we say always, in Confucius would say, would have to always be in context. So the time, the situation, and the person. And we see this in the analects, particularly when different students ask the same question. In book 12 of the analects, you have 4 students asking the same question, and that is how to practice humanity, a central concept in the philosophy. I'm going to just take out 2 of these passages, 2 of the students and Confucius's answers, to show you this contextualized, sort of tailored responses that Confucius had. So the first is the questioning, the question by Yan Hui, who you may know was considered the best student of Confucius. In fact, Confucius said that Yan Hui far surpassed his own abilities, and he was also praised by his fellow students. So American sinologist Paul Golden actually said that he thinks that this is probably the most important passage in the entire analects. And he says that's because you have Confucius's top student asking the most important question. So asking about a key central concept in the Confucian philosophy. So it's a very important passage. So how does Confucius respond? Well, he gets straight to the point in terms of a kind of metaphysical understanding. So the idea, he said, of humanity is to master oneself, to overcome, habits, thoughts, attitudes that might be negative, and recover this innate tendency towards ritual propriety. So ritual propriety is also another central Confucian concept, but the idea is that we revere or respect the dignity of others around us. This is human dignity, and we give that due respect. So it's not a two-step process, it's really one step to give rise to the idea of respect or reverence, and therefore the other thoughts will sort of disappear. And that's the idea of this humanity or being humane. And he even told Yan Wei that if you could do this for one day, then everything around you, the environment, the people would change, and the world would become humane. And you cannot expect others to do it. It must come from yourself. You have to do it first. So you see that the answer was very comprehensive. There's another part to the passage, but we won't focus on that today. But the idea is that this is Confucius's answer to Yan Wei. Now we can look at how he answered another student. So this is Sima Niu, is the other student who asked. And at the time, Sima Niu was very worried and concerned. His older brother was actually a senior minister in another state and was plotting a rebellion. His other brothers were also involved in supporting this rebellion. And Sima Niu was very, very concerned because if it failed, which was high risk that it would, then his whole family would be implicated, and on top of that, they would be executed. So in this state of stress, anxiety, he's asking Confucius, how is it that I can practice humanity? And Confucius replies very succinctly that it's just being cautious of what he speaks of. So, being cautious of what you say. And that's because in his context, in his situation, if he was to share this plot, this rebellion with others, they may be also implicated and associated. So even and despite the fact that he's anxious and stressed about what will happen, he has to still be considerate of others. And so if he can do this, then in this situation, this would be the practice of humanity in his context. So you can see that there's two very different ways of answering the same question, and both of them were also key students in Confucius's in the texts. So therefore, we come back to that idea of the bell, and the point is that you only give as much as the other person can really understand or accept. And so there's this idea that Confucius explicitly says here, which is that if someone is really open to what you have to say, and you don't tell them everything, it could be because you're trying to conceal something, or you are not, more likely you are not perceptive of the situation, you're not perceptive of that person and their attitude. So you let the opportunity go to waste. Now, why is it that he's saying let the person go to waste? Because from the perspective of Confucius, he was happy to share with others his knowledge, his ideas that may help them in their lives and address some of their issues. So by not providing that information or not sharing this effectively in that opportunity, that person may not ask again. That person may not think of that question again, and then it would be letting that opportunity go. On the other hand, if that person is not receptive, then really it's a waste of our time, isn't it? It's a waste of words. So that's the other extreme. So he says the wise person will not do either of these things. So they have to be perceptive in terms of understanding the other person. And that was key, that it's repeated again and again in these Confucian texts, that it's important to know the other person. And that's more important than them knowing you. The onus is on us rather than the other person. So rather than this conversation being simply a transmission of information, or on a unidirectional or bidirectional transmission. It's actually more a meeting of the other person's mind through your own sort of opening up to that other person and the situation. So that takes me to the other aspect of when we think about the metaphor of the bell. And that is not just the sound, but the actual bell itself. That, in fact, the bell is able to resonate in that way because of its emptiness. So emptying one's mind. And Confucius explicitly says this in this passage. It's likely that someone was, or his students was saying that he had this all, encompassing knowledge. And so Confucius denies this. He says, no, that's not the case. There was once a common fellow, and he says common fellow meaning, possibly a person of the public, but it's not in a denigrating way. So it's likely that he's trying to mention that this person was not an official, was not a government official, because Confucius was clearly across and specialized in the statecraft and politics. So perhaps this person asked a question that he hadn't really considered. So he said, being empty-like. Empty-like. So the idea is not jumping to conclusions, not thinking, gosh, is this question worth my time, or that sort of thing. But for him, he sort of had to let go of that and really take the person seriously to get to the bottom of what his concerns were and to address his issue. So this idea of being empty-like is what Confucius particularly instructed and mentioned, but it's also demonstrated in a later scenario. So in this particular account, the people of Huxiang, so it was likely that Confucius and his students traveled to this place, this village, and they realized that these people were not receptive to their ideas. They were therefore difficult to talk with. But so happened that a young person came to ask for a meeting with Confucius, had some questions. And therefore the students were very concerned. They were thinking, well, why is it that Confucius is spending time with this person and doesn't he have better things to do? So Confucius explained, well, actually, my concern is not with, what happened before, what this person has done, what their family or even the villagers have done. But actually, my concern is really about this particular moment and the fact that he has, this young person has good faith. So he's come with sincerity, with the idea of wanting to learn, with questions, and therefore my responsibility is to him in this moment. It's not what happens after, whether he decides to take it on board later, whether he forgets it. Well, that's really not my concern. My concern is right here and now, being able to respond in the way that this person requires and is not more, not less. So again, being that bell. But you can see here that the bell is not just what he says, but how he opens his mind to the various possibilities of this particular encounter. And that's what we see here in terms of this emptying of the mind, that it's being opened and not having preconceived biases or prejudices about the person or the situation. It's very interesting when we look and think about modern psychological studies. The idea that has been well researched is first impressions. So a very famous research article by Willis and Todorov, published in 2006 in Psychological Science, sort of showed us how quick it is, how fast it is for us to judge others. It took 1/10 of a second, really. And that's really before someone can even say anything. And you can see here in their abstract, it says, the person's likability, trustworthiness, competence, aggressiveness, all of these, sort of deeper character traits that you supposedly form these first impressions of. And it's also mentions here that after this judgment is made, then thereafter in the interaction, really it's just a reinforcement of what what your first impression was, rather than changing substantially. So this is, on first impressions. But imagine if it's the second time, third time, or repeatedly you see this person, then in your mind you have a whole database. What happened last time? What did they say? What did they do to me? So this is what social psychologists would call schemas. It's a network of associated meanings or prior knowledge that we store in our memories, in our long-term memories. And just like typing in an internet search engine, the moment that we think of that person, or that person we encounter that person, then all of that sort of comes up. It's brought up in our own database, and therefore we are not really a blank slate. We see and we respond through a filter. And that filter can sometimes be quite, of course, it can be positive if we have positive sort of memories of this person, but also if we have negative memories, then that can also lead to even self-fulfilling prophecies. If we think that this person is rude, then we ourselves are rude or not as respectful, and then and so on and so forth. So it's so Confucius, in this emptying of the mind, is to always think fresh. Think from afresh when we encounter this person or this interaction, and this is clearly explained in a later part of the text in this instruction. He says, "Don't be wary of someone deceiving you or some bad faith." So clear that from your mind. Don't come to the interaction with this bias. But rather, it doesn't mean that you do not understand the reality of the situation should it change. So it says the wise one will be able to perceive if that is the case, if there is deception, but certainly don't have that filter to begin with. So the idea then is that you open yourself up by emptying your mind. And I really love this story from the Mencius, and it's about a key historical figure. His name's Zichan, from the times of Confucius, the spring and autumn period. And so who was he? He was a key figure because he was actually the chief minister, or you could call him something like the prime minister of a state called Jin. So this is the state here. You can see it here, the state Jin. But you can also see from the map that Jin is in between two rather large states called Jing at the top and Chu in the south. Okay, so north and south, and they're sort of sandwiched between. Now, these two states at the time were competing for hegemony. So what does that mean in modern terms? Is they were competing to be the next superpower. So Jin, along with all the other smaller states you can see, were sort of stuck in a difficult situation. They couldn't offend one state or be too close with another state because they could be attacked by the other superpower if they weren't considered their friend, but rather their enemy. So Jin, you can see, is clearly in between the two. And when Zichan was the chief minister, what is recorded is that Jin, the sovereignty of the state, was very well respected by the two so-called superpowers, or the two powerful states, because of him, because of his diplomacy, because of his strategy and his foresight. So during that period, over 20 years, where he was the chancellor, the chief minister, Jin sort of enjoyed relative stability, particularly against the attacks and threat of those two other states. So he was considered and praised by Confucius, but considered to be quite wise with such foresight. But there's this anecdote in the Mencius, and it's the idea that at one time someone gives Zichan this fish. It's still alive, so what he wants to do is to release it. Hands it to the pond keeper, his employee. But the pond keeper has a different idea and actually just eats it, cooks it and eats it for dinner. he goes back, the pond keeper goes back and tells Zichan that actually he was released and, was very happy swimming into the depths of the water. So Zichan just responds with happiness, of course, it's back in its elements, that's great. So the pond keeper leaves and tells others that, in fact, Zichan is not that wise. Who says that he's got this foresight? When really, he didn't even know that I misled him. Now, if we come back to that idea of this clearing of the mind or this opening up oneself, rather than thinking about the other person as deceiving oneself, we can see that very clearly here, that Zichan is, the question is, well, did he know that he was being deceived? And if he knew that he was being deceived, why did he respond in that way? So if we come back to what Confucius said, really, then it's that idea that he doesn't think of the person as deceiving him. Now, even if he did know, well, perhaps he wanted to give the other person a chance. That he's happy and didn't need to dismiss this person over a fish, but to help the person, to give them another opportunity in case the person realized later that actually Zichan did know, but didn't call me out. So, as it says here, the noble person, yes, they are responsive in a way that should be, but not when the person misleads them with something contrary to the Tao or the way. So the idea here is that Zichan was thinking of the best of this person, but also did not have emotions cloud his judgment as to how he could respond in a way that was potentially beneficial to this person and how this person may have reacted in the future. So this idea is that comes from this particular anecdote. Now, the other, so that's the metaphor of the bell. And the other metaphor that I want to discuss with you is the metaphor of the tree. Okay, so this particular passage in the Analects has been discussed or described in terms of a tree. There's 4 parts to the passage. And if we focus on the last part first, immerse in the arts. So think about the analogy of the tree. So the top part of the tree, the fruits, the flowers, the leaves, branches, are actually the most visible, right? And in this particular passage, when we think about Confucian philosophy, the 4 subjects that were in Confucius's curriculum, statecraft, knowledge, this communication or conversation. So any career skill or any form of learning and knowledge can be considered these fruits, the fruits of our labor. So it's the things that are visible that we can contribute and offer to others. But where does that come from? And then that makes us think about, well, where do these, if we sort of trace back down, where does it stem from? Well, it's the trunk. So that's the next part of the passage, which is to be grounded in humanity. So the trunk, as you can see from these photos, clearly there's a part that's above the soil, there's a part that's below the soil. Above the soil is the practice of humanity, the practice of this, we could call it kindness or benevolence to others. But below the soil is what Confucius mentioned to his top student, Yen Hui, the idea that you have to master yourself. There's this internal sort of self-regulation that's occurring all the time, so that you can take into account and be considerate of others. So that's what's happening underneath the surface, such that you can actually show this practice of humanity above the surface. So that's this trunk. And then where ultimately what's anchoring the entire tree, and possibly the most important part, if you take out the roots, then there's nothing. The tree won't last. So the most important part of the roots is the last 2 aspects of the passage, which is to aspire to the way and hold on to virtue. It's the idea of virtue. So roots are often not visible, sort of below the surface. And it's just like our thoughts, the so-called virtue that Confucius mentioned and taught for the full development of the human being. And these are sort of what's inside, right? But yet, it's the mind, these thoughts, that connect us to others. When we think about the sufferings of others, when we think about others, then we reach out to them. So there's this connection that occurs inside through this cultivation, through this our understanding of the way and virtue. So that is ultimately what is anchoring us. So there's this idea of the tree, or this metaphor of the tree, is that what we say, our speech or our communication, our conversation, must be anchored in this humanity and the idea of benefiting others and thinking about their human dignity, a deeper respect for their human dignity. And therefore, this speech, Confucius' ways, is a precondition to art of conversation or effective communication, is a deeper sort of development of ourselves. And that's what allows us to truly be empty, to truly think of others rather than have these things inside us in the filter. It's through this anchoring to virtue that we can that our words have weight, that our words can be trusted. When we think about the Chinese character for trust, it's very interesting that it's the words. So the character for trust, you can see here the character for speech, or yen, that we talked about in the very beginning. But next to it on the left is the character for person. So the character for person next to the character for speech. So the person standing by their words, the person doing what they say. And that's why, in terms of this idea of trustworthiness, Confucius would often say that we have to do what we say. So in this conversation, Zigong, another student who's pictured here, asked, how is it that I can be a noble person, right? And Confucius tells him that it's the speaking and the doing. They have to correspond. Our actions have to correspond to our words. And in fact, we should do before we say it, to really be trustworthy, to be trusted. Now, we have to also take this particular response in context. So who was Zigong? Zigong was a wealthy merchant who enjoyed understanding about the way, but he was also very eloquent. Now, the two, his profession and the eloquence comes together, doesn't it? That actually he was a very successful businessman because he's very eloquent, so a good salesman, really. And therefore, in some ways, Confucius is telling him, well, don't just talk about it, you have to do it. So it might, your business, yes, it might be fine, but in terms of your cultivation, in terms of this achieving of the Tao, or the way, then you have to be able to do it rather than simply speak it. So eloquence is not enough. So that's for Zigong. So the point is that in terms of conversation, that of course it's not just the sounds, but also how it is, who we are, and this is what's coming through in that metaphor of the tree. Now, another very important conversation with Zigong relates to this idea that perhaps if you are someone who's trusted and trustworthiness, if we look at the classic, the Records on Ritual, it actually mentions that the highest form of trustworthiness is not through a contract or an agreement. It's actually simply between two people who trust each other. And so really sometimes what we don't say is more important than what we say. And so this comes through in this conversation with Zigong. So it's likely that Zigong has been asking a lot of questions or talking a lot. And Confucius says to him, I wish I could just say nothing. Zigong then says, no, you have to say something, because otherwise how do we learn? Not only for us, but also don't just think about us, think about the people who we're teaching, the students, or people after who after your lifetime. So we have to pass it on. We have to transmit these ideas. And Confucius says to him, well, what does heaven say? So the heaven here in Confucian philosophy is the idea that it's not just the skies, the seasons, the atmosphere, but this kind of creator, or this natural mother nature that creates life, sustains life. It's often discussed in terms of the binomial Tiandi, or heaven and earth, that together are co-creators. But in and of itself, heaven encapsulates the idea of creation, or the sustaining of life. So, if we think about it, the sun rises in the east, sets in the west, and we have our 24 hours where we organize our day. The earth rotates around the sun, and we have our 12 months, the year in which we organize our daily life, but also our yearly calendar. So heaven doesn't need to say anything, and yet it affects all of us, and in fact teaches us about the highest forms of wisdom. So this particular passage has often been interpreted in a very Taoist way. Taoism, the Taoist tradition will talk about how, in fact, the highest form of teaching is without words. It just is, and we simply need to intuit. We need to be able to be observant and understand, rather than think or discourse about it. And in fact, Taoism is very skeptical of words in a way that they can lead to misunderstanding, and they are very slippery with these concepts. So when we read the Taoist text, there's this dialectical kind of way in which it's written that sort of makes you question every sort of word and what it truly means. So the Taoists had that idea that language was not that important, and in terms of Buddhist ideas as well. The idea of language then is like the finger pointing to the moon. You don't continue looking at the finger, but you look at the moon. That's what you're meant to understand, the reality, rather than just simply be attached to the words. And Confucianism would be similar in the sense that Confucius is saying, look, I've said a lot, but that's not really the aim. The aim is to be able to live it, to be able to practice it, to think about it in your own life. And therefore, this particular passage is not just, some people would say, it's not just telling Zigong, no, don't talk too much. Confucius tells him, I don't want to talk. And because Zigong himself talks a lot, he likes talking. So in some ways, people say, well, if we think about the context, he's talking to a student who really likes to talk, so he's telling him not to. But at the same time, it's also saying that, well, perhaps there are some things that is better left unsaid, and actually that's probably where your mind should be at, and you try to intuit that rather than saying it all out and perhaps causing misunderstanding. So the idea then is that what we say, what is not said, is actually more important than what is said, and that's through us and our self-development. Makes me think of sometimes the best in the best friendships you have. You don't really need to say very much. You could just be a look, and the other person already understands. So that's that kind of trust, that sincerity that you have between you, that Confucius is getting at, that that you understand already. So the discussion today in terms of conversation, it's a two-way street, but it's also that idea that it's very contextualized in the Confucian setting. And the idea is that, like the bell, we have to empty our minds, we have to think, be open to the possibilities, and be able to be considerate of what that person needs in this particular point in time, not more and not less. And then in order to really achieve that emptiness is through the analogy of the tree, that we're rooted or grounded in this development, in this understanding of the way and the virtue, such that our words are beneficial and therefore can be trusted. And that, I guess, are two key aspects and concepts of what Confucius said, and this idea of his conversation. So that brings me to the end of today's exploration. Obviously, there are a lot more ideas, but I look forward to hearing your questions and whether you have any thoughts. Thank you. Stop share.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. I found that fascinating.
Thanks, Rob. Let's see if there's questions. Okay, I can see there's 3 questions. So the first question is very interesting. Yes, so you mentioned the importance of emptying one's mind and knowledge. So the idea that we have this learning of of what Confucius has recorded. So does that knowledge then hinder the emptiness? And I think this is interesting, isn't it? That on the one hand, yes, you want to be able to benefit the other person, and to do so would require you to have the requisite knowledge and understanding and skills so that you can provide advice. So that, therefore, on the one hand, as the question suggests, knowledge is very important. Okay? But then on the other hand, there's this, as we mentioned, Confucius said he didn't have the knowledge. He said, "Oh, do I have knowledge? No, that's not the case. I'm empty and I ask questions." And then there's that emptiness. So they seem to be contradictory, don't they? And the point here is, if I would like to use a somewhat Taoist sort of interpretation, which is that actually whether it's fullness or emptiness is actually based on that moment, if that makes sense. So we are constantly sort of accumulating, so there's this idea in Taoism that we're accumulating knowledge and learning and skills and learning so that we can help others when the need arises. But when the need arises, when someone asks the question, then we have to empty ourselves so that we are fully perceptive of what that person needs, and then be able to reach into our database and find what it is through our long-term memory of that knowledge or skill. And that doesn't work if we are already full and thinking that that person needs this. We have to, in that moment, sort of think of the other person. And so when we think of the other person, in that moment, our mind is empty, in the sense that we have completely opened ourselves up to the needs of that situation, rather than thinking what I want, what my agenda is, what I want you to do, and therefore I respond in this way. So that's the idea. I wonder if that makes sense. So yes, we have knowledge. It's very important. All of us in our various professions will have specialized knowledge, experiences that then others can draw on, that we can provide guidance for others when they need to, and if they ask. And the point is that when they do ask, then we have to be very cognizant of what level they are at, and what it is that they want to know at this point in time. And when you're fully cognizant and perceptive of that other person, inside you are empty, because you are not thinking of yourself and how much I know. So that thought is not there, which is very Taoist in a way, because the Taoists will say it's non-action. You're not actively thinking of anything in that perspective. Okay, if I didn't answer the question, please ask another one for that first question. But the second question then is, did Confucius talk about body language? In many ways, there are passages in the Analects which record how he acted. Okay, so how he acted and how he talked to others. There's, in fact, all of Book 10 is really observations of Confucius as opposed to his words or his conversations. And you have in these passages, there's very quaint passage where it says, when Confucius was talking to the higher officials, the lower officials, and then the members of the public, how he acted very differently. And not because he was disrespectful, but actually at different levels they required different expressions of respect. So that in some ways then you could have, that would be this idea of body language. Now, what's interesting is that of course in the children's literature, so children's primers being the textbooks for elementary education in pre-modern China, what children would read and in some ways be very familiar with reading these texts over a long period of time. They talked about conduct. So it's been described as part of conduct literature. In medieval Europe, there was a genre of conduct literature. So in many ways, the Chinese children's primers could be considered conduct literature as well. And it describes how children should, teachers gives instructions on how children should communicate. And it talks about, as being a junior or being younger, that, for example, when you ask a question, you, particularly of your teacher, you have to stand up, you have to speak in a loud voice, don't speak too softly. These sorts of things provide eye contact. So that's more on the beginner's, baby steps to show that you are respectful of the other person's as a human, as that human dignity. So in children's primers will have a lot of these instructions. But Confucius himself, if we look at the sort of Analects, it doesn't necessarily have instructions simply on body language, but we can see Confucius in practice, that he himself adopted various postures and tones. His way of speaking was different to the not only different students but also levels of officials. So that could be considered this kind of body language. Importantly, of course, when we look at something like the idea of family reverence that I mentioned last week, that there's a line on family reverence that says that that when we address our parents, when we talk to our elders, that probably the hardest thing is our demeanor. So our demeanor, meaning our countenance. And they use the word sir, which, if I can type it into the chat here. So the word is sir in the Confucian classic. And this particular word is interesting because most people interpret it as simply, your countenance, how your facial expression is this idea. Confucius says it's very difficult when you're talking to your elders, when you're serving your elders or helping them out. This is the thing that's most difficult. It's your expression on your face. For example, your children might not want to do something, and obviously it shows on their face, but they can't say no. So this demeanor is very important. But actually, if we look back at the original meaning of this word, sir, it's sort of it refers to the part between our eyebrows, this part here, which was meant to reflect our qi, or our sort of innate being, our character. And so this idea is that, it's who you are as well. It's obviously your facial expressions, but also who you are. And it's seen in your demeanor. And so it's not body language as such, but it's also your facial, your expressions as you interact with people is very important. So I guess that would be in terms of the idea of body language from the modern day concept of body language. And then the third question, are there any conversation topics that Confucius identified as taboo? So certainly the idea of ritual propriety or ritual etiquette would be the sort of setting limits on what we should or shouldn't say, particularly when it comes to children's primers, to help children sort of understand how to be tactful. And but obviously, as we develop experience, it's the contextualized again. For example, you'll read in even something like the records on ritual, the idea not to speak of the shortcomings of others and not to boast about your own strengths. So these are sort of general. They're not really taboos, but things that you would try not to go on those topics. That why talk about another person's faults? Actually, the focus is on the strengths of others. So think about the strengths of others rather than their faults. And if we don't speak of their faults or shortcomings, then you're not focusing on that aspect. Don't boast of your own strengths, because obviously there's still more that we have to improve on. And I'm talking about myself here, the idea that I have to improve, so there's nothing to be that proud of. And then if you are estranged from anyone, so for example, there's someone that you have cut ties with through friendships, then don't speak ill of them. That's very interesting because, for example, if you don't, why not speak ill of them when clearly you have no intention of being associated with them ever again? Well, the point is that it's not that clear cut. Perhaps that person needs time and space to change. You also have to give them that opportunity, and they could change. So if we speak ill of them, it means that we think that they haven't changed, and it also means that more and more people will have this, as I mentioned before, this schema, this thing in their mind when they see that person, when they encounter that person, leading to self-fulfilling prophecies, that person is never given the second chance to make amends. So don't speak ill of them, if particularly for people that you're estranged have these kinds of relationships with. Then the sort of taboo issues would be family matters or private matters, confidential matters. And just like we mentioned with Simanyo, that particular student, then clearly his family's plotting the rebellion, that would be something that he should keep to himself. Be cautious, very cautious, and best not to say it at all. Because other people don't want to know that information. But more importantly, you could harm your own family. So that's also is another one that is also taboo would be Confucius. If he was a state working for the government, he should try to think about the interests of the government rather than sharing state secrets. So that's something that's not difficult to understand, but that's also in the classics. And then other sort of more common sense sort of ideas on conversation, like don't talk about joke about at the expense of others, or not speaking about perhaps your when you're happy, when you've succeeded in something, when clearly someone is feeling disappointed and disheartened in that particular moment, but actually trying to understand their state of mind. So again, it's that meeting of the minds, that even if it's not asking a question, that in that interaction you are trying to judge and trying to evaluate and empty yourself so you can understand the other person and what's on their mind, so that you can respond effectively. So if the other person is grieving, they're not feeling well, then and on a mental level they feel disheartened, then don't come up with all the great things that have happened to you, winning the jackpot, that sort of thing. So these are sort of very, again, going back to that idea of humanity and ritual propriety. So ritual propriety helping us to achieve humanity and thinking about how words can be beneficial, if not beneficial, at least not harmful to another person's state of mind and their mood. So that's probably more on a fine-grained kind of ideas on conversation. Are there any other questions? I don't think that there are any other questions, but I think my time is up.
Does anybody have any other questions? We're just about coming up to 8 o'clock. So if we don't, then I think we should all thank Dr. Catherine No very much. Fascinating, new ideas, and a lot to think about. So thank you, Dr. Catherine, and thank you, Dr. Kelly. Thank you also, Fang, my fellow SACU Council member, for technical help with Zoom. And we hope to see you all and more friends in a month's time. Again, Thursday, 17th of April, we start series 2 on making friends and entertaining. So lecture 4 will be how to win friends, the Confucian Guide to Friendship. So hope to see as many of you as possible then. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.